Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's Let's Talk Aging. My name is Molly Wisniewski of the Upside to Aging, and today I'm here with Kate DeBartolo to talk about the Institute of Healthcare Improvements Initiative, the Conversation Project. So Kate, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about our conversation today. Your mission at the Conversation Project really speaks to a need that everybody can relate to and we all should be talking about. So with that, can you tell us a little bit about the Conversation Project, its mission and your role?
Sure. So thank you again for having me and us, and for your viewers and listeners for being interested in this topic. I happen to be calling in from Boston, Massachusetts right now at the IHI offices, and the Conversation Project is a large national initiative with the goal that everybody's wishes for care at the end of life are both expressed and respected. There's kind of two sides to that, a little double helix, if you will, of how do we get the general public to be thinking about this more and what matters most to them, and how do you talk about that with your loved ones and break some of those taboos, and then also how do we make sure that the healthcare system can actually respect those wishes when the time comes. We have no preference for what somebody might want at the end of life. Our goal is that people have these conversations around the kitchen table with their loved ones and not in the ICU. You know, how do we get this to happen earlier? We know that a crisis is a really hard time to learn when things are happening, or to get people to get along. And I would say one thing about us is that we're really focused on values, not just on medical decisions or legal decisions. I think sometimes people do advanced care planning and they think it's all about feeding tubes and CPR, or about having a will, and those are all very important things, but how do you document? But for us, we're focused on the values that are important for your loved ones to know. So with that, we have a ton of free resources. Our goal, we've got a website, a lot of free resources, conversation starter kits, tools for individuals. If they say, I got to figure out how to talk to my mom, I don't know how to do it, they could come and find those resources. And then, you know, you're asking about my role. I'm the National Field Director for the Conversation Project. And what we've been trying to do is build awareness about this topic. How do we get more people to realize this is something they should be doing or thinking about? How do we give them tools so they can have these conversations? But what we found quickly is that different people in the country were saying, I want to bring this to Boulder, Colorado. I want to bring this to Miami. I want to bring it to Barrington, Illinois. And we know it's so important to reach people where they live, where they work, where they pray, that this isn't just a medical thing, and how to get this out to the masses. It really shouldn't come from a medical setting. And so I work with thousands of individuals and organizations around the country who are trying to bring this to their region or their community or their book group or their sphere of influence. And so that's what I do.
Wow, that's amazing. And it's so great to hear that you're finding more and more people are interested in what you offer and the topics that you are trying to promote to start these conversations. What type of conversations specifically do you aim to cultivate with people?
So talking about being focused on values that people have. And I think that for a lot of people, it's hard to think about, I'm talking about my end of life. That's so hypothetical in some ways. I don't even know what I would talk about. Again, is it feeding tubes? Is it medical things? So we try to get people to think in a more open-ended way. You know, if you're thinking about what matters most to me is, you know, ... fill in the blanks. There's this shift from answering questions about what's the matter with you to what matters to you. So rather than focusing on a diagnosis or what's wrong with you, what do we need to fix? It's what matters to you. And given that, then we can come up with a plan. So we ask a lot of scale questions. On a scale of 1 to 5, are you concerned about too much care or too little care? Do you want your family to do exactly what you say no matter what? Or do you want your loved ones to do what makes them feel comfortable? Kind of showing a range where, again, there's no right or wrong answer. Like getting people to think about where do they land on that. That can give them a place to start in a conversation. And then we also try to help people figure out who might you talk to about this? When are you going to set up time to do that? Here are some icebreakers. How can we help you through that? So that's kind of the type of conversation we're trying to help with.
Right, that's great. And I like that you mentioned the icebreakers, because I was curious. I think when you talk about end of life, well, anybody, the first thought is like, no, I don't want to talk about it. And I was curious how the responses from people, while they might want to talk about these things and they don't know how, are they more comfortable with icebreakers? Are they, do you find that they become more engaged when they have that type of control over the conversation and that sort of thing?
I think a couple of things. It depends on who we're reaching. Sometimes people really do want to have the conversation. They feel like they saw something with a loved one or in a movie that they've seen or something where it's kind of weighing on them. We know that actually 90% of Americans think this is important to talk about, and fewer than 30% have done that. And so that's kind of the bridge that we're trying, or the gap that we're trying to bridge. And so some people's responses are like, oh, phew, I've been trying to figure out how to bring this up. This is really helpful to have something to kind of hold on to and look at. There are some people who are dubious depending on who's telling them the information. Mm-hmm. This is one reason why we don't only want to be in medical situations, and/or we have to work better on that medical environment. But if the doctor says, oh, Mrs. Smith, here's some stuff on end-of-life care planning, you can be like, what are you telling me? This sounds terrible. But if your clergy person is telling you, or you're reading a book at your book group, or you read something in the newspaper, that can kind of lighten it a little bit. So the responses have been remarkable. We do events in public where we can get hundreds of people together and they're going through the starter kit with a neighbor, like a person just sitting next to them at a table, not a family member or a loved one or somebody they know. And sometimes we can't get them to stop talking. It's kind of like people have opinions on the matter and what they would want. It's harder to talk about it with your loved one, but sometimes we can talk about it with a total stranger far more easily.
No, I can totally relate. I mean, I think I would feel the same way. That seems validating to me, talking to somebody that I might not know, and because the emotions aren't there, you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings if you choose to, whatever you choose. That makes me think though, because a lot of the time the assumption with end of life conversations is just that, like, do I want to be on tubes? Do I want to be on life support? Do not resuscitate. And those end of life decisions.
Yeah.
More than that, are there more decisions beyond those type of very serious ones that people should also be considering and may not be because they're scared to have those more intense?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that come to mind for me on that. And we joke that we should have called this the Conversations Project, that it's not one conversation that you get to have and you can never change your mind and it applies to you at all times. Right. That it's kind of always too soon until it's too late is one of the kind of comments that comes to mind. And for us, it really shouldn't just be about feeding tubes. It's really, how do you want to live your life through the end? So given where you are now, and I think this is an important thing, when sometimes people say like, oh yeah, my grandma needs to have that conversation, but not me yet. Or like, this doesn't apply to me yet. Right. And that's not true. That everybody should be thinking about, once you're 18, if something unexpected were to occur, even if you're going to be totally fine, but bear with me on this, and there is a period of time where you can't speak for yourself, who would speak for you? Mm-hmm. And if they were speaking for you, would they know what matters most to you? Right. And that's not feeding tubes and ventilation necessarily. It's those comments about, what are my chances for recovery and the setting that I might want to be in. We've got people who, there's a funny article we saw recently of like, if I'm ever in that situation, I hope my loved one keeps tweezing my eyebrows, or I hate having the sheets tucked in around me. And so if I can't speak and you keep tucking the sheets in around my feet, that's going to drive me crazy. Don't do that. And so what are the things that are important if you couldn't speak for yourself? And we know that I think it's over 50% of people over age 65, if they're admitted to a hospital, are in a situation where they can't speak for themselves. Mm. And so this idea that and it doesn't always mean that they are dying. You know, that these conversations are not just for that very short window that is the end of life. It's how do you want to be living right now? And your answers might be different when you're young and healthy, or once you're diagnosed with a certain illness, but you're living with it kind of like a chronic illness, versus as you're getting more and more serious or acute.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I think that's a really good point, because my assumption when I first started learning about end of life conversations was just that it was all of those scary decisions that you have to make. But they're not. They can be just that. I hate the sheets being tucked in.
Yeah, I know.
Think about that.
And I think that what I hear from clinicians is it doesn't actually help that much to have a piece of paper that says yes, no, 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 yes, with no context.
Right.
Because what happens if you are in a car accident and there's very high likelihood that you'll be totally fine if with 2 weeks or 2 days on a ventilator? That might not have been what you meant. There's no way to write down on paper every hypothetical scenario that could play out. And this is why we think it's so important to have conversations and to speak about this, and not have some document sitting in a filing cabinet that nobody can find. And they don't know if it's still up to date because you did it 10 years ago before you had your grandbaby or whatever it might be. Right. But what we hear from a lot of providers is if there's somebody that we could talk to who knows you well and could help us determine, you know, what your values are, what makes it a good day for you, what, you know, if you're a ballroom dancer and there's going to be an important thing that we need to decide, that's almost more helpful for the clinicians or for the family members, or it's not always a family member, but we need to understand who you are as a person before we can make decisions. And so just answering about feeding tubes isn't going to get you there.
Yeah, no, that's true. How have you found clinicians, particularly, are they versed in this type of conversation, starting that type of conversation? Do you find that that they're a good source for people to go to when they're starting to think about these things?
It's hard to say like a yes or no, because I think so much of it depends on the specialty. It depends on how recently they were trained, where they were trained. We see a wide variety of many clinicians who weren't properly trained to do this. You know, I'm in the business of life and hope, and I don't go there. Right. This is a failure, even though the death rate's holding steady at 100%. You know, so there's some clinicians who just don't feel that comfortable. There's others, especially in palliative care and hospice or in other kinds of settings, that might be extremely well trained to do this. And I'm always a champion of palliative care consults, because many times they just help families or loved ones have conversations. Right. But we also know that many health professionals haven't done this themselves. They haven't had the conversation with their own loved ones. And, you know, we're still sons and daughters and spouses and have those same issues, but it's changing. So more and more are getting trained in this way. A lot more health professions student programs are starting to incorporate this. There's a lot more programming and continuing education credits going on. And it's not just medicine. The same thing is happening with clergy. Many clergy haven't been trained to help their congregants with this, and they're starting to express a lot of interest. And I think that one of those concepts about how people's answers might change is actually a really important thing to be incorporating and make this a normal part of care for all adults. That how clinicians can start engaging somebody when they are 50. And it's okay, like it's your 50th birthday. I do this with all my patients. This is just a standard. I'm going to ask you this every year. Has anything changed? What do I need to know? Then it doesn't become quite so scary or very sudden at the end. You know, we're really proactive about this in medicine, about talking about smoking cessation or weight gain or exercise. And so how do we kind of get to that a little bit more? I think that there's a big tie in some ways we talk about to the birth movement. That it wasn't clinicians saying, ladies, like legs out of the stirrups, let's hop in the bathtub, dads come on in with the camcorder. Like it was individuals and families saying birth is not just a medical experience, it's a human experience. And we have a say in the matter. And now so many more, I got a lot of friends having babies and coming up with their birth plans. And it's not to say that everything's going to go exactly the way that you had planned. but you're asked about it and you're asked to think about it and you're given information on all the different scenarios, and the whole team works with that in mind, what your values are and what matters most to you. That's what we're always going to try to do, even if medical scenarios might change. And so I think that's starting to happen with the end of life as well.
Oh, that's so encouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear. And I love that it's coming from the people themselves. We talk a lot in the aging services about particularly this generation that's in need of services, or going to be in need of services, and they're so vocal and their own advocates, and they're wanting to stay in their own homes to age. And what I think a lot of us in the aging services need to do is kind of catch up to that and say, well, how do we do this, and how do we best allow you to do this? And it seems like this conversation, well, the Conversation Project, is really a staple in that. You're not just planning for retirement, you're planning for, if you're going to stay in your home, you're going to have to plan for those types of events so that you can stay in the home if that's what you choose that you want to do. So it's a great service. So what advice would you give to people who are still having this difficulty? You kind of mentioned a few at events, talking with somebody that you may not know, but you're all over for Father's Day. Do you just kind of have this conversation with Dad, or do you prepare them first to say, hey, I want to have this type of conversation? How do you get everybody on board?
I think, again, it's going to depend so much on the dynamic of whatever the family unit is that you're in, or the people that you're dealing with, or how much is somebody going to be totally open to this versus you got to prime the pump a little bit along the way. I think, there's this concept that it's always too soon until it's too late. There's plenty of people who think, oh, we got to wait for that. Like, we'll deal with that when they're older or when they're getting closer. They're healthy now. We don't need to do it. And that this can be multiple conversations. And so, I talk about it when I got married, I had the conversation. If we have kids, we're going to have the conversation. So normalize for anybody, like, just get started now. You don't have to wait for anything. You can say, I heard this interesting, I was on this blog that I like, or I heard this interesting video and it made me realize I didn't know what you wanted. Yeah. Or like, it just got me thinking. You can there's so many news stories now. So sometimes you can just bring it up as like, have you thought about that? Or would you want to talk about it a little bit more? Just kind of see where they fall. Yeah. And for some people, it's like, yeah, let's sit down for an hour and a half and talk about it. And for others, you might just want to sprinkle in little questions over time and ease somebody into it. I think especially with scenarios where somebody may have a family history of Alzheimer's or dementia, as an example, where waiting for a diagnosis can often be too late. Now you're even further down the trajectory. And so thinking through, and maybe it's that framing of like, you seem good now, Dad. I realized, I saw this natural disaster that occurred, or this terrible terrorist activity, or something. I saw this movie and somebody got in an accident on their motorcycle trip, and I realized I wouldn't know what you want. Could we think through what some of these questions are? And I think if you frame it, what we found is people are much more responsive to this topic when framed in a positive way. Mm-hmm. So rather than, here's all the scary stuff that's going to happen to you if I don't know, or the doom and gloom, when it comes from a place of love and respect, and I want to honor you, and you've cared for me my whole life, and now it's my turn to make sure I know how to care for you, people seem much more open to it. I think the other really important thing to note, we've been talking about families, but that's not always the case. People don't always want their family member to be their healthcare decision maker. They aren't local. But it's really important, if you have a large family, include more than one person. So, my mom was one of 7. She was the decision maker for her parents, but all the other siblings were on board. Right. They knew that, like, Margie's in charge, but we also know what Mom and Dad said they want. Right. And that's so much better than what we call the Seagull Syndrome. You've got like the kid who's helping take care of mom on one coast, and then the brother comes in from across country, swoops in, dumps all over the whole plan, and flies back out. Yeah. And so you can help avoid that by just getting a couple people. They don't all have to have the big conversation, But even to just call up and be like, hey, Timmy, just wanted you to know I told Robbie what I wanted. Like that can solve, you hear in the ICU, well, mom never told me that. And so I think sometimes just making sure people are up to speed, there's no secrets about this. There was a woman I met in Florida who said that she was her husband's healthcare proxy. They'd done all the documents, they'd had the conversation. She felt really comfortable with what he wanted. But she was his second wife, and he had not told his adult children that she was the decision maker.
Yeah.
And she said, I realize now it would make it so much easier if he just gives them the heads up now when it's not a pressing time.
Yeah.
So that there's not like World War III that gets started.
Yeah, definitely. But I think you really overviewed what we all, my experience is the conversation kind of gets stuck in this loop where you want to start it, you say, okay, let's have this conversation. But then when it gets to the details, it kind of breaks apart. So
and that's our hope. We have a guide for how do you pick your healthcare proxy or your healthcare agent. So who can you think would be that would be your voice? Like you get to make the choice, but who would be your voice? So you can kind of think through that. Now, if you figured out who you want that person to be, this is a scenario where if I want to share my wishes, then we have a conversation starter kit that you could go through with the person and be like, I want to show you how I answered these questions 1 to 5. But the flip side could also be true. If you're trying to bring this up with somebody and they say, yes, I am willing to talk about it, you could bring and print off for free our conversation starter kit and say, well, how would you answer this question? Or what do you think about this? But it helps it be a little bit, it grounds it without being too specific. You don't need medical background. You shouldn't have that even. I think one thing that I want to clarify is we've seen a wide range of what people's reactions are to this topic. Some people say like, yep, I know exactly what I want. I've got all this autonomy and I'm going to tell you exactly what I want and you need to follow it to the T.
Right.
And then there's other people, total opposite side, where they say, I don't care what happens. I just want my kids to decide and whatever makes them feel better in the moment. Cool. I have no opinions on the matter other than they do it. But that woman, we were in Nevada and she was the one telling me that. She had never told her kids that. So she was just not having the conversation with them because she didn't want to be too prescriptive. And it's this idea that like conversations matter. You could at least tell them that.
Yeah.
Hey guys, if anything happens, I want you to know that like you can make the call. Don't feel guilty. I'm happy with whatever you decide. That's a huge burden lifted for them.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of guilt, particularly for older adults and families, the amount of guilt that I've seen. I've worked in long-term care for 12 years, and that's one of the biggest things is I don't know. I'm doing this because I have no choice. Like this seems like the best decision, but I don't know, and that really I don't know is so painful. I think particularly after their loved one passes on, and they have kind of left with that.
I get so many people who come up in tears saying, the only thing my grandma wanted was to die at home. You give the home example. And we couldn't do it. Her Alzheimer's got so bad and we weren't able to care for her in the house. And I feel like the one thing she asked for, we failed her on. And so many of those kinds of things come up. And actually, I think the idea of home is a really important one to dive a little more deeply into. What are the values behind that? Because it's not always medically feasible or financially feasible or physically feasible. I was in New York City and somebody's like, I'm on a 5th floor walk up. We can't do this all the time. But I know for my grandma, having her cat there, that was the most important thing. So, okay, well, if we can find a facility that lets you have your cat,
right,
okay with you. For other people, it might be that they want to make sure people are visiting them every day or that they have home cooked food, or like, let's start to unpack it a little bit more so that I understand what the values are behind that. And I don't feel as much guilt because you've actually helped make the choices. Now I'm just your voice when the time comes.
Yeah, I'm so glad you clarified that because it does. It helps so much, and I think it changes the perception of what it means to get older. I think a lot of the times the perception gets stuck in all of the bad things that could happen, or that loss of control or loss of independence. And really, when you do have these conversations and you do put some time into making those decisions, you maintain that control and independence.
Right.
It's just you're allowing somebody else to assume that for you,
Right.
which is so important. You mentioned the kits, the starter kits. Can you just tell us a little bit about what types of kits you offer?
Sure. So they're all free for people, and we have some language translations of them as well. So we have the one that I mentioned of how do you pick your healthcare proxy, or how do you think about, and how do you be a good one? So if somebody's asked you to be their healthcare proxy and you think, I got no idea what that means, you can learn a little bit more. If you're trying to figure out who do you want to be your decision maker, if you ever couldn't speak for yourself, there's a guide for that. There's another one that's that conversation starter kit of, okay, once you've identified your person, what are you going to talk about with them? And that's where we have some of those scale of 1 to 5 questions. We have one very similar to that for patients with Alzheimer's disease or other forms of dementia, and for their loved ones. And what do you do if there's a situation where it's so much further down the line, but you maybe have to pull the loved ones together and kind of talk about mom in the center as if she were answering these questions, but kind of helping people think that way. We have one for parents of seriously ill children as well. And then we have a 5th one around how do you talk to your doctor or other members of your care team.
Wow, that's great. So it's really all encompassing.
And then there's also a whole, that's kind of what it, for individuals, we then have a flip side of various resources for clergy or for community leaders who want to help spread the word in their region. If you really love this and you want to take it on in your hometown, then we've got a bunch of other resources for people that way too.
That's great. Yeah, it's really something that I think we all should be talking about. And it's so nice to hear that you're finding that a community is really coming around this.
Yeah.
I did want to note, because you mentioned the Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia toolkit or starter kit. And in there, I was perusing it and I was really excited to see that you also prompt family caregivers to take opportunities to become that person's support. In one example you had mentioned, or the prompt was, the person is telling you that they're not remembering as much, that they're having a lot of difficulties, and the common response is to say, oh, Dad, don't worry about it. It's okay. You're fine. We got you. But you make a point to say that this is actually an opportunity to start a larger conversation and to be that person's support system. And
acknowledge it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's by simply saying, tell me more.
Yeah.
And it's so important. And I was curious if you found that just comes naturally with having the conversation, or was that something specific that you were finding that needed a little bit more attention?
I think some of it is that our punchline over and over and over again, whenever we hear different scenarios from people, is have a conversation, or like open it up a little bit more, learn more, be inquisitive. Don't shut everything down or try to come up with a 1-sentence answer or a checkbox answer, because that's not going to be that helpful when the time comes. And so it's both to relieve the sense of angst or insecurity from the person who might be sick or getting older or dying, and what are they concerned about. But then also on the flip side, for the caretaker, we know that depression rates for caregivers go down significantly after the loss of a loved one if they've had the conversation.
Wow.
And so this concept, that death can be very sad and upsetting, clearly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always have to be, and people have grief, but it doesn't have to be very complex grief, or you don't need to tear apart in a family or to feel like I didn't know what my mom wanted, that's what we're trying to avoid, so that you can be present and be a support for somebody without all of that other complexity as well.
What a beautiful mission.
I know, my friends are like, oh, you just do death and dying all day? That must be terrible. And it doesn't feel like that at all. It's really, how do you help people live through the end the way that they want, and to feel supported, if they're the caretaker or the loved one, because again, this is the common thread that we all have. You know, as much as Google or Elon Musk might be trying to work to keep this from happening in the future, it's holding steady right now. So, um,
I completely agree. I completely agree. And I'm so on board with the project and your mission. And it's something we're talking about in the aging services a lot. Just how do you have those conversations and how do you become comfortable, um, really getting into it and just figuring out what the person wants, because that's the only way you're going to get person-centered care.
right.
And then I guess from that perspective, from the aging services, what ways do you think the aging services can support your mission in terms of using your resources and the education that you provide?
I guess it would be to keep spreading the word. So the resources are free and freely available. And so really helping people realize that this applies to them and that they can and should be thinking about this. And it's not just for when you are like 99 years old with 12 conditions. And even then, a lot of people are, hesitant to have the conversation. That it should really be about normalizing it. And it's not, you're dying, Mrs. Jones, now we need to talk about this. But how you honor, respect, serve these people and your family, in the time that you have left. What would be good days for you? What should we know about you as a person, and really put that person back at the center of the care we provide, of the structures we create for someone. So again, it's more about how you want to live your life through the end, and not just about how is somebody going to die. So we see a lot of groups that are working to exemplify this. There was a large hospice group we were working with on the West Coast who realized that none of their own staff had done this work themselves, even though they did it every day. So they brought in trainers, and now everybody's done their own advanced care planning, and realizing that we are employers in the community. In Memphis, they said we got 10,000 hospital employees in the city. If each of us had the conversation, we could start helping to normalize this in our communities. So there's a little bit about what can we do professionally to serve our patients or clients or whomever, but also just take it on personally. There's a real movement happening where people are doing this, and we can help be the ones who lead that and help make it comfortable for others.
I love that. Thank you. Yeah, I love that. And I think you're right. You would think that in the aging services, I'm not speaking generally, because there are those that are well versed, but it's still a topic that we talk about in terms of needing to kind of strengthen the voice. And a lot of, I think the conversation gets surrounded around the home and where you want to live, and it doesn't go beyond that sometimes.
Right.
So it's great to know. And I did have one question, because it's my understanding that your wishes, no matter what, you can have them written down. You don't need a lawyer per se to for some things you do, but just to have things written down. Can people use the conversation starter kits as that form that they give to professionals? Or
so it's not a legally binding document, but many people still share it. So we actually have like an EMR version of the questions that we ask for electronic medical records, where they might be saying, okay, I want to go talk to my doctor or my nurse or whomever, just so you know, here are some of the answers to my questions that I answered. It won't be as binding as an advanced directive would be, but it certainly is better than nothing in the chart, or nothing. Having a conversation with your provider gives them a lot more context for what matters to you. So it's just one more person who knows a little bit more about what you want. And so we say share with anyone and everyone.
Good. Yeah, that's great advice. And I understand the legal part of it, that it's
and there's different rules state by state, but you can look into kind of what your state's rules and requirements are.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to just kind of talk about the project and your role there, because it's, as I've tried to convey, I think this is really important and something that we all need to just be a little bit more comfortable with. And
yeah.
be okay with talking about. It's not as scary as we might think it is.
No, and it can be really loving. That's the big takeaway I've had for people. It really brings people together in a way that, these conversations can have a lot of tears, but they can have a lot of laughter and jokes and funny memories. And it really helps open up a relationship to be allowed to talk about these things a little bit more, not, again, just in a doom and gloom and death and dying and hospitals and feeding tubes way, but about your values and what matters and how do we respect you and honor you and love you. And that's been a really neat part of it. So thank you so much for having me and us on this program, and hope that people find the resources helpful and they can let us know if they want to get more involved in their communities.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I will be posting your website link down below, but then also the links to the various starter kits, which are on your
Great.
website as well, but just so people have easy access to them.
Wonderful.
So, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.